Hi everyone! Welcome to Pattern Busters, where we try to understand the different kinds of randomness we see every day and what they mean to us. I'm AJ, your guide when it comes to all things mathematics, and I'm here with my friends Czarru, Chloe, Nina, and Camille. For today, it looks like we're going to go on a geometric journey to find out our pattern for the day. Are you coming with us? Great! Now let's see where this journey will take us. So it looks like we'll be going to Czarru first, and he'll be explaining how geometry is linked to our emotions. After that, Czarru and I will go more in depth on how patterns evoke certain emotions in us. And for the most awaited part, the rest of the gang will walk us through the real-life applications of what we've learned with things like facial expressions, drawings and product design, architecture, and body movements. Alright, let's get started on our journey.
We know that geometry is a branch of mathematics that we use in real life because it uses shapes. And as this branch of mathematics evolved, people used the knowledge to help us build many things we see in our lives today. The best examples would be the construction of buildings, houses, roads, dams, and many other infrastructure that we are used to seeing. Geometry also has other practical applications like computer graphics, visual arts, in astronomy, and interior and creative design. Did you know that we can also find applications for it in the medical fields and biology? But what we wanted to point out is what we think is the most important application of geometry, or to be more specific, geometric patterns. And that is how it's connected with our emotions. Emotions? Yep, that's right. It seems odd to relate geometry, something we normally associate with mathematics and logic, to emotions, which isn't as logical. But there are connections between geometric patterns and what kinds of feelings or meanings they give to people. And to help us with that, let's try going to Czarru to ask him more about geometry and our emotions.
I'm guessing you all know what geometry is because it's such a fun and vivid and jaw-dropping branch of mathematics. But just in case you don't, it literally means earth and measurement in Greek. It's a really old branch of mathematics, cause we've been studying about shapes and sizes and distances and positions for a really long time. And these topics are exactly what geometry is concerned with. But fear not this ancient math because nothing can be more relevant to our present-day experiences. Geometry is very practical. As I've said, it's fun and vivid and jaw-dropping.
So what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of geometry? I'll give you a few seconds to think. Okay, whatever you're thinking is probably correct. Let me share what my friends thought. They answered shapes, lines, 3D objects, angles. Basically, these are the things that we study in geometry.
I won't list down any more of geometry's contributions since AJ already told you about them earlier, but at this point I want you to know that aside from those tangible and arguably expected applications, geometry has been linked with something more intangible, unexpected, and personal. Geometry has been linked with emotions and feelings. But before we go into real-life examples of this unusual relationship, we have to first understand what emotions are. So, what are emotions? According to Reeve, emotions are short-lived, feeling arousal, purposive, expressive phenomena that help us adapt to the opportunities and challenges we face during important life events. But this definition is too technical, so let's just focus on the two important words from that statement, feeling and arousal. Basically, emotions are what we feel when a stimulus physically activates or arouses our bodies. These stimuli are what we call antecedents, and these can be many things depending on what theory you subscribe to. They can be environmental challenges, previous experiences, or anything under the sun which can serve as a stimulus. They can be tangible or intangible, concrete or abstract. Note, however, that for our purposes, we won't be limited by the usual or basic emotions we commonly know, like happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, and others. We will extend to all sorts of feelings and thoughts, whatever they might be. This is because our focus is on what is triggered in people when they encounter different geometric figures. What do they feel when a certain line or shape acts as an antecedent? Now that we have an idea about both geometry and emotions, the question now is, why are we connecting them? Geometry falls under mathematics while emotions fall under psychology, and you might think that math and psych have little to do with each other, but that simply isn't the case. Math is used in psychology, especially in quantifying abstract psychological concepts. It's also used in predicting human behavior and assessing treatment and intervention programs. Okay, so what about geometry specifically? Gestalt psychology, with its emphasis on the whole and its parts, is very much involved with geometric shapes, positions, and distance. In cognitive psychology, geometry is also involved in our perception of objects. We as persons are influenced by physical appearances. And Trotman argues that shapes appeal to us in the same way color and other visual phenomena do, and the perception of visual phenomena is very much an emotional antecedent. Furthermore, knowing the feelings found in geometric figures also has practical value. As you will see, this can apply to arts, design, and other human activities. Now it's time for us to check out actual lines, shapes, and patterns. AJ will talk about them as well as their corresponding meanings and feelings. Exciting!
Forms and shapes have a great influence in the subconscious mind. Geometric patterns are actually made up of shapes and lines, so we'll discuss the emotions evoked by all three of these geometries. First are shapes, second are lines, and third, of course, the patterns themselves. All shapes have their own meanings influenced by our subconscious mind because of the meanings we've accumulated over time from language and association.
Researchers have found that shapes such as the square, triangle, and circle have universal meanings. And if you think about these meanings, they are logical because of the way we use them. Squares are often used as the foundations of our houses and buildings when designing and planning, and this fits the emotions of stability, security, balance, and order. Inherently, we've used a geometrically stable design for our buildings that also means stability for our emotions. How about the triangle? It's supposed to give us feelings of action, aggression, and energy. What are famous landmarks or things that usually have triangles? We have the Eiffel Tower, caution signs, and pyramids, both the Egyptian structures and the 3D shape. They show us energy and action. Lastly, let's look at the circle, which is characterized with completeness, gracefulness, playfulness, and youth. And where do we often see circles? Children often play with circle-shaped objects such as balls, the Ferris wheel, hula hoops. Clocks and other circular objects also just show us the completeness of things, like these pictures. All shapes are composed of straight or curved lines, which each communicate their own various feelings and moods. And since we discussed shapes, let's go on to the lines. Lines can be subdivided into 5 types that convey different moods. We have vertical, horizontal, diagonal, zigzag, and curved lines. And they can be more generally grouped into 2 groups, straight lines and erratic lines. Straight lines suggest order and distinctively masculine qualities. These lines, such as vertical and horizontal lines, suggest height, width, strength, distance, calmness, and stability, which is why we commonly see their use in architecture, from long tall buildings to wide stable dams and strong bridges with wide foundations. The next 3 lines are erratic lines that are aptly associated with erratic emotions, like diagonal lines. These are straight lines, but because they are slanted, they happen to suggest movement or lack of stability. In animation, these are often used to highlight a specific movement of an arm or a running character. Meanwhile, zigzag lines convey action and excitement, as well as restlessness and anxiety, in contrast to curved lines which convey a sense of comfort and ease or the sensual quality of the human body. And when we combine all of these lines and shapes, we end up with different patterns that take in all the combined meanings that these figures are supposed to convey. In a study conducted by Trotman 2021, she asked about 6 patterns in an FGD, and her results showed that these can be categorized into 3 types, specifically their characteristic, color, and area of application. We took the liberty of grouping these patterns by similarity in the usage of their shapes, and you will see just how the emotions evoked by these patterns are actually very similar. For the first and third, these used circles. Both these patterns use circles in different ways. With the first pattern, we can see a lot of optical illusion-like looking circles, while the third utilized circles in a less obvious way. Because they both use circles and curved lines, there was the expected feelings of calmness, home, and nostalgic effects from both of these patterns. People did say these feelings, and they also mentioned shapes that they saw. For the first pattern, they mostly mentioned water, and in the second pattern, they mentioned the flower and the sun patterns, which are clearly seen. For the second and fourth pattern, square and rectangular shapes with angular lines were used. Because of these, we're supposed to feel logical, a planned feeling, maybe arranged, or even claustrophobic and secure. These were the feelings elicited by these patterns, and the second pattern actually seemed more like a graveyard or a church because of the cross-shaped symbol we can see in the middle. And the fourth was inspired by optical art. The last group of patterns used erratic lines, such as spirals, which are seen in the fifth pattern, and curves for the sixth pattern. These were the most creative patterns in all of the six, and the participants responded with the expected emotions of movement, dizziness, or harmony, which are usually associated with zigzags and curved lines. We understand that all the information may have been very overwhelming, so we took the liberty of organizing it into a table for you to digest it a bit better.
And the main point of all these patterns was that they elicit universal feelings from people, even with all our individual differences. Isn't that amazing? Different geometric patterns give off different emotions, and people actually study them to use them in various fields. So to see how that works, why don't we visit Chloe, who will show us exactly how we face these things on a daily basis.
Going back to what Czarru told us about emotions, our emotions actually serve many functions, and communication is just one of them. Just imagine how difficult it would be to talk to other people or even to maintain relationships if we had no clue what the other person might be feeling. So, how do we express our emotions? Well, one way is through facial expressions. Seeing a person's facial expressions can often give us a clue of whether a person is feeling happy, sad, angry, and so on. But how is that related to geometry? Great question. Facial expressions are actually formed through the movements and shapes of the facial features. For example, research suggests that linearity, diagonality, and angularity are often associated with anger and threat, while roundedness is associated with happiness and warmth. This makes a lot of sense when we take a look at a smiley face, wherein a smile and even the person's eyes are normally curved upwards, making the cheeks and face more rounded as well. Meanwhile, an angry face often consists of the two eyebrows slanted downward and inward towards each other to form a V shape, which you might also see on the cheekbones and the jaw, overall forming a less rounded formation on the face. To help us understand this further, an experiment by Aronoff and his colleagues sought to prove this hypothesis by isolating these geometric properties from facial displays to simple visual patterns. They were able to prove that an acute downward-pointing angle, like what I described for the eyebrows of an angry face, is related to threat, while increasing roundedness of an ellipse, which is said to mirror an increasingly happy face, is related to warmth. But interestingly, they also suggested that perhaps the symmetry of our facial features also plays a role in denoting these kinds of meanings for these geometric patterns, especially for the angry face. Focusing further on the happy face, another example of geometry in facial expressions is in the different kinds of smiles. First is the reward smile, or the kind of smile you make after experiencing a happy moment. In reward smiles, the noticeable feature is the wide smile of the mouth and the symmetry of the smile and eyebrows. Second is the affiliative smile, or the kind of smile you'd show to a person you just met to make yourself look more approachable. This is characterized by the pressing of the lips over the mouth in a more elongated and less rounded smile. It would make sense that the reward smile is regarded as the true or enjoyment smile, since it depicts more roundedness than the affiliative smile. And if you recall what I mentioned earlier, more roundedness relates to greater happiness and goodness. The last type of smile is the dominant smile. As the name implies, it is often used to establish dominance in a hierarchy and can actually convey negative feelings such as contempt and pride. this is quite comparable to what we know as the smirk, which is a lot more asymmetric and diagonal compared to the two previous smiles. As you can see, this brings us back to the previous observation that diagonality may elicit feelings of threat. Aside from seeing them in our facial expressions, these patterns of roundness and diagonality can also be observed in other aspects of the human face and the human body, such as in judging attractiveness and even in body movement. But moving away from human anatomy, let's see Nina's next example of how else geometry is used in evoking emotions.
It's a no-brainer to think that lines and shapes are essential to a work of art. In fact, it's an element in art that cannot be separated. So, how do artists use simple lines and shape to convey emotion? Well, simple shapes and forms are the starting point to every design and figure. Take perhaps a drawing of a human body, a sketch of our hands. They all start from lines and shapes. Often in drawing, we associate curved lines to the curves of the feminine body, and a straight boxy shape towards the masculine figure, although these curves also depend on how the artist uses them. So let me ask you, what do you feel when you look at this Pablo Picasso painting of a weeping woman? Do you feel turmoil? Sadness? Was it because of the jagged, sharp lines that outlined her features? The bright colors? As you study the painting, no doubt that the use of the sharp lines added to the emotional turmoil of how the portrait should feel. Sadness. This is where the concept of emotional design comes in, and it has a really simple meaning. Designers use this concept to evoke emotions when they create their products. A part of branding, product, and packaging design are logos and fonts. Have you ever wondered, why are there so many fonts?
Well, each and every font has its own intended tone of communication.
A unique personality of sorts, much like the lines and shapes that give off emotions. Typography, or the so-called study of font and text, have their fair share of ties with psychology. Yes, font psychology is a thing. And much like what AJ has said earlier, they will also have their own variation in style that may evoke emotional feelings. Well, here's an example. We have the word happy. When I tell you to think of a shape, or in this case, to choose a font that could visually represent the feeling of happiness, which one would you choose? First off, you have to know what the word happy means. Then, given the meaning, the majority would be inclined to pick the cursive font, and using the other font would give off a foreboding style that gives away the feeling of being, well, happy. What's interesting about lines and shapes is that they can make us feel a certain way. So see, adding a little bit of curves and edges to text can make it more expressive. It also applies to logo designing. There are far more categories to shapes than geometry. AJ has mentioned these, and it helps with the fundamental building of some of the famous logos we see and know today. So how can emotions be transferred to physical things? Well, basically, if you like the feel and shape of a product, you may find yourself happy. If you don't like the product design, then you might find yourself unattracted to it. Designers make extensive use of shape in design exploration, especially on the silhouette of the product. As like the small variations of our face can distinguish if we are happy or sad, like in Chloe's discussion, emotions can also be transmitted through shape. Here are two cars. Modern design cars have a more sleek design and may exhibit a number of personalities, such as playful, robust, and sporty, compared to the first versions of cars, which had a sharp and boxy build. Think about it. Sometimes, a simple tweak in the shape of a product may make it appear cheap or expensive, and in some cases, they can make people feel happy or angry, proud or ashamed, secure or anxious. As for packaging design, it revolves around how the product would be presented. Many designers use geometry to package their product for its space, safety, and aesthetic look.
Geometry can also be seen in packaging art.
Overall, A good use of these shapes would make a successful creative design that could create an emotional link towards the people. Now let's head over to Camille to discuss the geometry of emotion in architecture.
In 1943, Winston Churchill said, "We shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us." Do you agree with this statement? Well, we might all agree on this, but surprisingly, it didn't matter back then. It was only decades after that this made sense, both in the field of architecture and psychology. Now you may ask, what does geometry have to do with all of this? Geometry is actually a big part of architecture in terms of designing and constructing buildings. And as previously mentioned, geometry has the power to evoke certain emotions. As a matter of fact, we spend majority of our lives inside buildings. I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it. Do you realize it now? We sleep and live in our houses, we go to school and work in buildings, we eat in restaurants, and the list goes on. Even just the different building types already trigger psychological activities of feeling, cognition, memory, association, and thinking. This may also be the reason why most people find hospitals scary. Now, let's dive into the geometry of emotions in architecture. The psychology of architecture is called environmental psychology, which investigates the interaction between individuals and their surroundings. Take a look at these photos. Which one of these do you prefer more? Open or closed spaces? How about in this slide? Do you prefer high ceilings more? Lastly, do you prefer curvy-shaped or sharp-angled spaces? In order to understand this more, let's take a look at 2 famous buildings and the emotions that they bring out of people through geometry. First, the Parthenon in Greece is such an iconic landmark. There's actually a lot of mathematics going on here. There is a progression of golden triangles with a constant width-to-height ratio of 9:4, running the vertical and horizontal proportions of the temple and the spacing between the columns. Speaking of columns, the horizontal stance communicates the feeling of stability. Its perfect proportions, on the other hand, evokes harmony, which is one of the famous Greek ideals. Second, the United Nations Secretariat Building in New York. The anthropometric system used is based on the golden ratio and divine proportion principles. The building has the illusion of expanding dimensions of each section. It communicates the feeling of harmony by looking at how the sections come together and the feeling of balance given its equal proportions. All these are proof that Churchill's statement made sense after all. Indeed, buildings have direct effects on our emotions, and our emotions are a contributing factor to how these buildings shape us, which means that when we take geometry, architecture, and psychology into consideration, we can actually produce a wide array of emotions on individuals through the infrastructures around us.
Thank you to everyone who discussed the different applications of geometry with our emotions. And now we'd like to end this discussion with a quote by Edgar Allan Poe, where he says that there is no exquisite beauty without some strangeness in proportion. As we've discussed throughout this video, geometry isn't just applicable in the physically practical world, such as with architecture and design, but it's also seen with the simplest things we do every day, just like with our facial expressions. And this reminds us that there is just beauty in our diversity, no matter how strange those proportions may be. And this form of math is beautiful because it's such an important part of our daily lives, even if we don't directly see them. And that's it from us today. Thanks for tuning in for our episode on geometry and emotions. Pattern Busters signing off.